Hello everyone, and welcome back to the show. A few days ago, I did a poll on Instagram asking about requested topics for the next discussion, and the winner was the conditions required to end the war on Ukrainian terms. So we're going to have a short discussion about that. Now, to start with a question which I'm sure is foremost on everyone's minds, is it possible to end the war on Ukrainian terms while Putin is still in power? Or is it possible to end the war while Putin is still in power, Ukrainian terms or not? I am going to say no on this. I think a ceasefire would be possible, and under some circumstances it could be advantageous, but it's not going to be for a while, and it wouldn't be on terms acceptable to Ukraine until the war is already functionally won inside Ukraine and would become a more traditional border war between Russia and Ukraine. Putin has a very strong system of beliefs which heavily impact the choices that he makes, how he looks at the world, and policy decisions related to the war. And we have to take a look at those decisions and ask ourselves, would this permit an end to the war on Ukrainian terms? And I think the answer is no. Putin sees himself almost as a Peter the Great-like figure, the gatherer of Russian lands, rebuilding the core of Russia, greater Russia, not necessarily the Soviet Union, but within a lot of the same territorial bounds within Europe as the Soviet Union occupied. Putin, we have histories of him getting extremely angry, livid about the acknowledgement of Estonia as a country. And Russian nationalists tend to be pretty clear-cut and decisive about Ukraine and Belarus being essential parts of Russia. But this includes, if this includes Estonia, it probably includes Latvia and Lithuania as well. And to some degree, the other post-Soviet states in Central Asia, which he has made discussions of in the past being part of Russia. He's considered it publicly. Mind you, a lot of this was prior to his presidency, so if you want to look at what I'm talking about, you can check out Putin by Philip Short. It's an extensive biography, about 800 pages if I recall, and I will be doing a full review of it at some point in the future. Now, this rebuilding of Russia for Putin seems to have acquired an almost godly, messianic quality, mystical quality, and leaves very little room for changes of plans and very little room for any sort of permanent abandonment of a Ukraine which isn't pro-Russian and to some degree functioning as almost a Russian vassal, if not necessarily quite, because they were satisfied with Yanukovych until the EU association agreement came up, if not particularly happy with him. So we can't really expect compromise on this from Putin, specifically and personally. There's also the issue of the West and NATO. And this is important, if not in the same way that most Russian nationalists and supporters will frame it. But there is, in Putin's mind at least, a sort of clash of civilizations happening between Russia and the West, a la Huntington. And this has been steadily escalating for Putin since, it's hard to place it. There are a lot of choices that you could consider, a lot of times that you could take. One might suggest the Orange Revolution in 2004, the Bolotnia Square protests in 2011 to 2012. I guess you could put it at Maidan, but I think it's definitely earlier than that. You could even put it at Georgia 2008, but again, I wouldn't. So we have an ongoing civilizational clash that is at risk in Putin's mind of at any time becoming military, becoming violent, or if it doesn't become violent, at risk of peacefully subverting, infiltrating, destroying Russia from the inside, which is a common, not necessarily view, but almost like a, well, maybe it kind of looks like that happened, almost. Could it have been? No, but could it have? Look at the 1990s Soviet collapse in Russia, and there's more generally an understanding that the West has been out to get Russia and has been actively sabotaging Russia during that time, and before that, and after that. There's a lot of suspicion and a view of two yeah, two different civilizations that are not mutually compatible. And even if they were mutually compatible, the West will not allow Russia to exist peacefully because it needs to destroy something that it cannot control. So Putin is going to continue to some degree to look at options for winning this conflict, which will usually mean escalation and has been a pattern of escalation since very early in his development of foreign policy. I guess you could also put it at Munich 2007. So, what conditions might be required post Putin to make a Ukrainian terms victory possible? We'd have to first look at who might replace Putin, and we've got a lot of candidates, we've got a lot of options. We've got people like Mikhail Mishustin, the prime minister, who would be the official successor to Putin if he were to die while still being president. Mishustin stays out of politics mostly, which is funny for a prime minister. He is a very technocratic figure. He did work in the tax ministry, and Putin picked him almost as a manager who was understood to be staying out of politics, as Putin put it to Mikhail Kasyanov, his first prime minister. He was to stay off of Putin's turf, which included things like politics, foreign affairs, security matters. The prime minister is supposed to stay out of all of that. That applies to Mishustin. Could he take over as president? In theory, yes. It doesn't seem particularly likely to me. If he did, would he end the war? He would definitely be looking to end the war or at least de-escalate and look at a way to get rid of sanctions, which isn't going to be possible without an end to the war in the near term. So Mikhail Mishustin is probably one of the better bets to end the war, and it seems unlikely that he's going to get a chance to do that, and if he did, he would have to contend with a lot of factors before he'd be able to do it, including a very strong nationalist lobby within the government and within society. That's about 20% of society, and most of the really important or powerful figures in the government, people who are decision makers and movers and not just managers or organizers or bureaucrats. We're talking about people like Patrushev, Bortnikov, to a lesser extent, maybe Shoigu and Gerasimov, and Narushkin. Some of these people may be more or less open to ending the war, but they would have to end it on very specific terms. And I think for Bortnikov or Patrushev, it might even be off the table entirely. So let's look at them. Patrushev is a very conspiratorial person. He's very suspicious. He is unusual, and he's very interesting, and he also stays out of the public eye to some degree. He was head of the FSB in Karelia, which is the Russian region on the Finnish border. Then he moved to one of Putin's old jobs in management, essentially government management and property and finance in Moscow. Then he took over from Putin as head of the FSB from 1999 to 2008. And in 2008, he moved to be secretary of the Security Council, which was also Putin's job in between being FSB head and being prime minister. Patrushev is very influential. You may recall the big Security Council meeting February 21st, 2023, where February 21st, 2022, where Putin called out all of the big figures in the Russian government and had the foreign minister and the point man on Ukraine and some of the other major government figures give reports on the state of events in the Donbass and Ukraine, Russia in general, and Russia, the West in general, and then asked everybody to give an opinion on the annexation or recognition of sovereignty of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And at that meeting, there were only 3 people who went in going in knew what was happening. And those people were Alexander Bortnikov, head of the FSB, Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, and Nikolai Patrushev, head of the Security Council. He is one of the most, if not the most, influential figures in the Russian government. He has Putin's ear. He has been close to Putin since their days in St. Petersburg, and he was a rising star in the KGB at a time when Putin's career was mostly unremarkable. Very significant figure, and he is highly conspiratorial, as I mentioned earlier. He's been expressing recently that the United States wants to depopulate Russia and destroy the Russian state so that the United States elite has somewhere to flee when the Yellowstone volcano makes America unlivable. He also made a comment about how the United States wanted to break up Russia because they viewed them as having undue natural resources that they didn't deserve. His source on this was comments made by Madeleine Albright, at the time the US Secretary of State. No such comments could be found, and the source on this was eventually traced back to an FSB psychic, FSB or perhaps Federal Guard Service, it slips my mind at the moment, but a psychic employed by the security services who claimed to have found this quote from Madeleine Albright's dreams. And he cited this as a major policy piece. He's also talked about, you may remember we went through this interview here before, described global warming and climate change action as a myth used almost in a genocidal way by Nazis, I believe was the direct term that he used, in the West against Russia and the Third World. So he's an odd figure, and he is very aggressive and very hawkish, and I think his chances of ending the war would be quite low. He is a big figure in the security establishment. Other possible successors from there include Viktor Zolotov, who probably wouldn't be too eager to end the war either, although he might look to de-escalate it. Alexander Bornakov, who I'd put in a similar camp to Patrushev. Sergei Naryshkin, who I don't think really has any chance of succeeding Putin, so I won't cover him in too much depth. So those are the big candidates from the security services. I don't see anybody from the military having a serious chance of taking over. Shoigu, for instance, has already been proven incompetent, and the main reason he remains in his post is a long history of personal loyalty and connection to Putin, which is very highly valued in this state. So, moving past the military and the security services, we've already looked at one technocrat. We've looked at Mikhail Mishustin. I think what I said about him applies to some degree, more or less, to most other technocrats within the government. Looking at Elvira Nabiulina, the head of the central bank, or people in the finance ministry. They're not really serious candidates for succession, but if they were, they would have some sort of interest in ending the war, and they would be open to that. Now, Prigozhin. Does he have a chance of taking over? I'm leaning towards no, but it is always possible, so I'm not going to say never. Never say never in Russian politics, because a lot of surprising things can happen. But it seems highly unlikely that Prigozhin will be able to take over the Russian government. I would rule it out as a serious possibility right now. He could destabilize things, but he's not going to be the next president of the Russian Federation. It's highly, highly unlikely. But if he did, he might consider some degree of de-escalation, but it would be very hard to do considering his public political persona and his support base being ultranationalists. Even if he wanted to de-escalate or stop the war, it would be very difficult for him to do politically. Although I think a lot of his nationalist aggression, if not necessarily his views, are to some degree performative. It's very rare that views in the Russian state are entirely performative or entirely genuine. And with Prigozhin, I think it's a fairly balanced mix of performative and genuineness. So I wouldn't bet on him being able to end the war, and I wouldn't bet on him necessarily wanting to, although he might consider de-escalation. So if we want to end the war, what do we need to look at? We need to get to a point where Putin has a successor who believes that it is in Russia's best interest, whether in the context of a struggle against the West or independently, to put an end to the war. We also would need to have a situation where this is politically possible within Russia, which would be difficult to achieve given all the propaganda that has been directed at mobilizing the population for war, if not necessarily for politics. So one of the big things that we're looking at is economic change, the effects of the sanctions and how hard they end up hitting and how they build over time, and how Russia's economy independently does on its own. If the economic pain became severe enough, somebody other than Putin might be able to be persuaded to consider an end to the war. And they might also be able to consider a temporary pause in hostilities if they judged it to be advantageous to the future of this grand struggle. Patrushev, I think, is maybe a little bit more fanatical than Putin, but he's also more pragmatic. And he might consider a pause on the war if he thought that eventually it would make Russia stronger and enable the reclamation of Ukraine in a more efficient way with fewer losses. So he might be able to persuade that. And economic pain would be a huge factor in that, as would politics and the internal situation within Russia and Ukraine, and diplomacy with the West. How would we get to that point? More sanctions would have to be supplied if we were going to do it faster. It might be possible under the current set, but more would be beneficial. More sanctions increases the pressure and makes it more obvious. Every round of sanctions is a recommitment to the concept of defeating the Russian war economy. So every round of sanctions makes it seem less likely that the current sanctions will be lifted, and that is very important. There might also be political requirements diplomatically for post-Putin Russia to make peace. These would probably, under somebody like Patrushev, mean serious things like withdrawal of weapons, potentially a breakup of NATO, or withdrawal of military forces from some NATO countries to some degree, perhaps a buffer zone of some sort. Political concessions would be probably necessary under somebody like Patrushev. Under somebody like Mishustin, what we would probably be looking at in terms of a diplomatic solution would look at something like sanctions relief and potentially the idea of economic aid at some point in the future, depending on how bad the situation became. But they would require some sort of guarantees of lack of economic war, which is something that Russia has been maybe less vulnerable to than many countries would be, but is still having a heavy toll on the Russian economy, and very specifically, of course, on the Russian military industry, which somebody who is taking over Russia would want to make a show of strengthening, because it would be an easy way to score brownie points after looking at how badly the previous administration has messed it up. How many concessions the Russians could demand would depend very much on how the war went. If it was still in Ukrainian territory at this hypothetical point, they would be able to demand more for leaving that territory. But if we got to a point where they were just able to make sometimes military incursions into Ukraine and chuck missiles and airplanes over the border, then their ability to demand things would be more limited. So it very much depends in terms of political settlements on how much we supply Ukraine in terms of weapons now. That will determine how much we might have to give up or how much they might have to give up in a possible peace settlement at some point. Now, of course, we're talking about Western concessions here and Western sacrifices, but we're also talking about Western loosening of pressure. So the priority for a technocratic follow-up government would be sanctions relief, and ideally a total end to sanctions. What would they be willing to give up for that? Well, first of all, the question is Crimea. Would they be willing to give up Crimea? And I think it highly depends on whether they have already lost it militarily. Then they might be willing to alter the constitution or change the Russian view of Crimea as their territory to being Ukraine's territory. But for this to happen, it would probably politically be necessary for them to have already lost it. Otherwise, it would be politically intolerable at home and would not be accepted by large sections of the populace, and could even be condemned by some nationalists, perhaps as treason. So it would be very difficult to give up Crimea, even in exchange for sanctions relief, even though a lot of the technocratic figures who might take over the government would prefer to give up Crimea, if it would get them sanctions relief rather than to keep it and keep the sanctions. They might still consider the political sacrifice of losing Crimea in the Russian domestic scene intolerable. So in summary, the requirements for getting rid of and ending the Russian war on Ukraine and removing the Russian military from Ukrainian territory, as well as ceasing any attacks from Russian territory onto Ukrainian territory, what would we need? Escalating financial pressure on Russia in the form of sanctions, escalating military pressure on Russia in the form of increased aid to Ukraine to the point of major Ukrainian military victories, particularly to a point where it seems unadvantageous to continue the war. A change in leadership to ideally a technocratic government led by somebody like Mikhail Mishustin, or potentially in a more limited form with more demands, change in government to somebody like maybe Naryshkin, Zolotov, potentially even Patrushev, but again, it seems more unlikely that it would happen with Patrushev. So a change in government, increasing economic and military pressure, and a political situation in Russia where it feels to the Russians that they can make sacrifices and not have their population come to tear their heads off. So, for instance, if Ukraine is demanding Crimea, they would probably have had to take it already, and the Russian government succeeding Putin would have to feel secure enough in its position that it feels it could give up Crimea in exchange for peace and sanctions relief without immediately being thrown out of power. And finally, of course, the West would have to be willing to provide things like sanction relief if the war in Ukraine was to end. And while that seems likely, it is not necessarily guaranteed, even if the Ukrainians were in favor of it, that the West would be willing to lift sanctions in exchange for a peace deal. So the formula is economic pressure, Ukrainian military success, and change in the Russian government to a technocratic or potentially hawkish but pragmatic new government without Putin. That has been our show for today, and thank you all for listening.